Hi, folks. One more episode of the Supply Chain Show. I bring experts from the industry, talk about the hot topics, especially focus on digitalization. Today is one of those topics when I'm talking about digitalization in maritime. Actually, not a lot of people know about maritime. So, my guest Rachel will give the overview and what are the challenges, opportunities, and initiatives happening in that part of the business. So, Rachel White has been an entrepreneur. She runs two companies. One of them is Cool Logistics. She's in the industry for about 25 years. She's an expert in maritime trade in general, also in the digitalization initiatives within the industry, right? So, Rachel, welcome on board. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you, Muddassir. It's a really great pleasure to join you and have a chance to talk with all of your supply chain listeners around and viewers around the world.
Perfect. So, are you based in London, right? Or in and around
Yes,
London?
yes, I
Great.
am. So I'm speaking to you today from a very snowy, frosty London. I think it's a
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
warmer where you are.
Definitely, definitely. So, without wasting any more time, let's crack on into the topic because the topic is so. First of all, the whole when we as a supply chain students, or even when I was studying my education, maritime is generally a left out topic, right? It's just not so. We talk about logistics, supply chain planning, procurement, simulation,
Yeah,
ERP system, but nobody really, unless you are studying maritime, they don't really talk about that. But when you work in the practical industry, then you realize how important that is because if you are whatever you're doing in terms of supply chain planning, getting right stuff at the right time, you got to know what's happening with the shipping industry or the maritime industry in general because our life depend on it. So my question is to give us an overview in general, what's happening in the industry, and then what's just tell us about the what's happening in the digitalization space within the maritime. So floor is
great.
yours.
Well, thank you, Muddassir. Perfect introduction. And I did want to thank you because one of my personal missions and passion is to connect and build understanding and knowledge between the traditional supply chain disciplines and the physical world of maritime transport and logistics. I think sometimes when people think maritime, they think about ships and shipping and oceans. And of course, that's really important. But the point to make is consider that global trade is something like, I think, $18.9 trillion at the moment.
Yeah.
A vast proportion of that at some point is going to go over the water in a maritime supply chain. But maritime trade is about a great deal more than that, and a lot of it's happening on land. So if you think about all the supporting infrastructure and services, you have the ports, the warehousing, the road, the rail, the intermodal. So the maritime trade in general, you have to think is a very big ecosystem, starting sometimes from deep inland, where a journey of thousands of kilometers has to happen to get to the ocean, and then can be the same at the other end. So I think the point I'm trying to get across is this underpins supply chain movement and global trade, and that thinking about this as an ecosystem of infrastructure, assets, and across land and ocean is the important point, because that starts to explain some of the complexity that goes on. And in terms of thinking about shipments that are maritime shipments, it's not just a physical movement. In the physical movement, there are many handovers that need to be, and handoffs that need to be coordinated, part of the complexity, and many, many players. There's also a heck of a lot of information. Every physical shipment has to be accompanied by a great deal of paperwork, much of which still is paperwork rather than electronic. And you think here about contractual, financial, regulatory, and operational documentation. So you have both a physical infrastructure and an information infrastructure that needs to get coordinated. And a lot of the challenges and the drivers behind parts of the digitalization, which is definitely going on apace in maritime trade and logistics, is all around that great big paper trail, the documents that need to be shared between multiple parties. And we're not just talking about industry players, we're talking very much about government and the regulators,
And the
things
banks as
like
well.
customs and the banks.
Mhm.
So yeah, you've got trade finance, you've got customs, you've got tariffs, you've got lots and lots and lots of paperwork. And the maritime industry and maritime trade is not lacking in data and information. That's not the problem. It's just living in lots of silos.
Yeah.
And they're not joined up. So that's as a context, the world I live in underpins the global supply chain. And of course, I'm sure you've been talking to your community about it. The pandemic has really highlighted just how important all those physical moving pieces, the ships, the containers, the ports, the trucks are to making supply chains happen, and how they can be enablers of supply chains, but they can also pose risks when there are breakdowns and congestion.
This recent issue of the lack of containers and the issue, I mean, people are paying, I've done a survey actually, 80% of the more people are paying more than 60% of the current rate, which is, I think, is ridiculous. But this topic, I want to touch base your view at the end, right? Because that's almost like what's happening right now. But I want to physically, I think first what I want to go is initially. So I think the way you describe is very well. It's not just about sea, it's about the intermodal land and sea. And most importantly, you said there's, of course, the material is flowing on the land and on the sea, but there's a documentation flow which is happening not just between the buyer and the seller, is also in between a lot of parties, which is government regulatory bodies, especially the banks and other financial institutes. So far very well explained. So yeah, please continue.
Absolutely. So that's that complexity. And, all those parties, it would be complex enough in a single country chain. But when you consider you have global cross-border trade, and that, for instance, in a maritime, say, take a container, because that's obviously the dominant mode for seagoing transport. If you look at that supply chain, the container isn't necessarily going to go point to point from origin port to destination port. Quite often it may be transshipped one or two or more times. So each of those adds extra handoffs and extra layers of complexity, because at every handoff point in the chain, people need to come together, and so does the required information as well. And this would take me on, if it's an appropriate time, to actually talk about what's driving digitalization in maritime trade and logistics, and what's actually being done. Where the initiatives are today. So digitalization is not new at all in maritime trade. And in fact, some very early initiatives specifically were centered around the port sector, building port community systems, where all the parties involved in an import and export movement who needed information could be on one platform, getting all that data. Sounds familiar, yes, with today? Yeah. This was driven by early technologies like EDI, which are still very, very prevalent in maritime trade. And this is going back, some of these go back to the 1970s. So people knew back then that there was fragmentation and there needed to be some solutions to share data. In a typical port community system, you will have the shippers and the supply chain managers, you'll have all the regulators, you'll have all the people who are moving and handling and managing a shipment in and out of a port, by way of example. So, this is a digital platform, but just with much older technology. So one of the big things we're seeing is the pandemic has absolutely accelerated digitalization. And many of the major maritime NGOs, associations, have been calling very loudly for that acceleration. People like bodies like UNCTAD, for instance, major associations governing ports and shipping, International Chamber of Shipping, International Association of Ports and Harbours, they're all calling for this because they recognise with the pandemic, we've got a few things that must be happening in supply chain and logistics in general, which is many more people working from home remotely, and that probably is set to stay, but also the need to apply this growing field of thinking around health security and health preventative measures at frontline handoffs, so because you've got to keep your port workers safe and your customs officials and your seafarers, and having, exchange of actual paper documents isn't really a good idea. So there's a big call to get on with it and to digitalise. So if I look at initiatives that are happening, one of the big ones, or one of the big drivers, huge driver, and it has been for decades, is visibility.
Yeah.
visibility through the chain. I've been fortunate to run a couple of 100+ events around the world talking about sea freight and the container supply chain, and every single supply chain manager, ocean freight manager, from a shipper who's come to talk to us has said, please give me some visibility. Let me know where my cargo is on the journey, and how it's doing as well.
Yep. But there's a lot of, I see there's a huge amount of startups popping up, right? And there's a millions and millions of investment is happening. So do you see those startups are eventually now delivering the promise what they have said they will deliver? Because I've been hearing there, I don't want to name any to bump up their brand. I mean, you can, but I can easily tell there's about $200 million has been invested by venture capital on just that specific problem. So do you see any of them are really delivering the promise?
Just take a little step back from that, because it's one of the topics that's important is A, what's going on in terms of the actual digital technologies, but B, how it's going on. And as you say, startups are playing an increasingly important role in this because of the different culture they bring compared to established enterprise. They're becoming very much part of how do we get digitalization working in maritime trade and logistics. And it's just the start. This thing's going to snowball the next few years, from what I'm seeing. So I think some of the startups which have become scale-ups or more, some of the early ones, and I'm sure many of your listeners might be familiar with Freightos, as a platform for, that's a platform for booking your freight, essentially, rather than have it be totally fragmented, was to get it onto one platform and make that booking process, pricing process, securing your shipment as easy as possible, because believe me, traditionally has not been that easy. And the major container shipping lines, that's definitely an area they're focusing on. How can we streamline our bookings? So that's a big aspect, and that's where the early startups came in. And yes, they've made a difference, definitely. And Freightos is one of the most, highly valued, and one that's gained the most VC funding. So that's one example. But now there's many across. And I'd say the ones I'm seeing, they're across things like freight bookings, making that whole process simpler. There's many that are around visibility, which is a piece I'd like to talk about. Right, how do we gain that visibility end to end? And there's many around how do we take traditional documents and turn them into a digital format. One of the big things, for instance, is the Bill of Lading, one of the oldest shipping documents in the world. And people are saying, now we need an EBill, an EBill of Lading. And that's going on right now, both amongst established companies and industry bodies, and with startups. Now, there's different ways of doing that, but that's where something like blockchain as a technology is certainly coming in. Recognition that if we can have, single source of truth and trust to hand off along the chain using blockchain technology, which seems to be perfect, then we could massively speed up, simplify the handover of all this document along the chain. And we have something there like TradeLens, which is a platform initially set up by Maersk Line with IBM, but now has a heap of shipping lines, ports, and other maritime trade players sort of on the platform.
Right. While this is happening, so yes, you're right. So I've already been part of downloading e-bills and everything. So that's happening, and it's a great initiative because it's definitely saving time. Is reduced. I think for me, when you talk about supply chain agility and responsiveness, so one of the roles you can play in that is by looking into what are the elements of each step, even mostly for the information sake, then the material flow itself how can you reduce it? One of them is bill of lading. I remember you have to wait for 3 to 4 days just to arrive because somebody shipped it is coming through DHL, and then even it's shipped by premium freight, you're just waiting and you cannot really clear your cargo, you're crapping yourself because you just don't have bill of lading and it's about to arrive. But EBill of Lading has sorted that, because you don't have to wait for three or 4 days for a DHL to arrive.
Yeah.
You just download, you go to the websites of Maersk or whoever, and Kuna Nagar, you download. So that's great, and it's happening. You're right. Which leads me to point what's happening. As you said, we talk about the startups and the old players and the legacy players and the new players, and how they are contributing to the evolution of this industry. So I think you explained it pretty well. But I want to, so I talked about a startup. Now I want to go back to the giants, right? Because I've been recently in touch with Maersk. I mean, he was, if not the biggest, and I think they are the biggest player recently. They could be second, following to HCL, I
Mm.
think. But they are transforming their strategy. So they are shipping. I mean, they essentially see, people see them as a shipping company, container shipping company. 90% of the money they make on shipping, but they have a strong realignment, or the new strategy by 2025. They want to make 50% of their revenue by offering integrated logistics services, basically, right? Which is, they want to control the whole end to end, basically get the whole 3PL out of the business, which is, for me, I mean, why they're thinking right now, they should have think this through 15 years ago, but I don't know, up to them,
Well,
right? Just to finish my question, but because I was part of their, I was training some people there and on SNOP, and that's why they're training the people, because they realize they are just a shipping people, right? They want to know about supply chain. So the question is, they spend a lot of money on this part, the visibility, and how to digitalize the information flow they are managing, right? So how you see that transformation?
well, you mentioned, thank you for the question. You mentioned, maybe they should have thought about this 15 years ago. And well, I'm here to tell you from having some decades here is they did.
Okay.
There was a period 15, 20 years ago when Maersk and other shipping lines absolutely tried this integrated strategy to bolt on inland logistics, 3PL-like services, warehousing, to become, as Maersk, as you rightly point out, its vision now is to become integrated global logistics provider, containerized logistics provider. So they did try it, but at that point in time, it just didn't work. And all the stuff that was built got disassembled.
Okay.
Because back to your point, they didn't develop the specialties and the expertise and the knowledge base in each area. But more than that, they probably didn't have the data. So
Right.
now we're in an environment where there's this ability to harness data in a new way through technology, through digitalization. And when you talk to Maersk executives and others, because others are on the same journey of integration, like where you are, DP World was a runner of container terminal asset infrastructure globally. Now it's bought a shipping company, it's launched loads of online tools, and it wants to become an enabler of global trade. But all of them will say the access to the data and the intelligence and knowledge that comes from that, along with the people, is what's allowing them to realize the vision. And if you look at Maersk's latest results, and I saw the CEO speaking on, I think it was CNN the other day and Bloomberg and everywhere, they have actually seen growth, because there's a lot of skepticism about shipping lines becoming integrated logistics people, right? But they have actually seen the biggest growth in their revenue from a smaller base was in the logistics services versus the actual carriage of goods by sea. So I think we're just going to see more and more of this coming from different directions, different players. Could be a shipping line, could be a port operator, could be other players. But the distinguishing thing for all of these folk that your community needs is they own the assets and they own the infrastructure. And if you haven't got ships and containers and ports, you need that infrastructure and assets in place first. Otherwise, it'd be like Uber operating with no taxis or taxi drivers. It just wouldn't be possible.
No, that's great. So that leads to the I think one of the challenge I see in the whole maritime is the first, as we established by now. So data is disintegrated amongst various players, right? Now I think the big players are trying to go for the integrated approach, which you mentioned, Maersk and DP World and all that, which is great. But that data and the integration of data needs to drive value for the customers, because essentially that what matters, right? You can invest whatever money you like, but unless it has been adopted by the customers and utilized to again improve visibility, improve responsiveness, improve the agility of the supply chain, it is no good. So do you see some challenges at the consumer end or to for this adoption?
Well, when you say consumer, do you mean the
Like
shipper of
people like
goods?
me. No, people like me.
Your good
Why? Because
self,
I'm a supply
exactly.
chain manager. Because I
Well,
I move stuff from my manufacturing to
yeah.
the my distributors, right? So, but nobody's talking to me enough about it. That's the point.
Well, you hit on one of the challenges. As I said, supply chain managers and shippers saying, please give me visibility has been the number one drumbeat that I've heard for
Yeah.
decades now in industry gatherings. And that's an area where the industry, the maritime trade and particularly container trade industry is really focused. So the first thing you need to do is find the technology again, the actual device to get to your place of having your smart container so that you can generate that data. And I'd say smart containers is one of the biggest movements going on now. So that means IoT, telematics, and sensors fitted to the container. So they actually are, 24/7 saying, hello, here I am. So we had something by saying that traditionally assets right along this maritime trade chain were dark, dumb, and disconnected. And now we need to make them visible, smart, and connected. And that's kind of like a foundation layer going on. I was talking with at a conference last year, I think, or moderating a session, and we had a speaker from Kuehne Nagel. I'm sure many of your listeners probably maybe do business with. And he said, look, we've got a problem here. These are one of the challenges. He said, the supply chain's moving faster. It's getting more agile. E-commerce is one of the factors there. So, everything's moving faster. But ships are quite slow, and I mean, this is the nature, you've got cargo that's maybe going from west coast of South America, into Rotterdam. It doesn't just magically appear because we haven't managed that Star Trek moment yet. It's got a long old journey. So he said, well, how do we marry up this slow pace of getting this stuff through the chain, not because of inefficiency, but just because of geography and weather, conditions and all the unpredictability? How do we marry that with the need for speed? And his argument was that visibility through having connectivity and using technology to see where stuff's at is kind of the replacement for speed, or the way to marry these two universes and what they need. What do I mean by that? Take as an example, like a shipment of refrigerated goods, which is very much in the news at the moment with, vaccines and everything, of course. If you can tell along the journey that there's going to be a delay in that shipment that could cause a problem with the cargo quality of a refrigerated good, and get that proactive information, to the cargo owner, then they can make some proactive decisions to mitigate a supply chain breakdown. So that's kind of what is definitely happening now. And in terms of the challenges for you guys, if you, I feel like I'm a spokesperson for Maersk here. That's not the intent. But Maersk has the biggest deployed smart container fleet in the world on its refrigerated containers. And they have been opening that data up to shippers so they can collaborate and look at not just the visibility, but using that data to say, hey, where are things, where are the breakdowns in this chain, when there are faults, so to identify and proactively then address maybe things that crop up regularly. One of the big issues has always been data, and still is, data sharing and collaboration. Regardless of the technology, is the data privacy, data security, who owns the data, who gets value from the data, who pays for it all. That may be happening in your industry with this sort of collaboration as well. And those conversations are working their way through, but there's still a very real, a real issue around how do you effectively facilitate data collaboration between all these parties, including between the public and private sector. So I'd say the technology is coming. The startups are bringing new ways and new visions because they don't have a legacy mindset. So they see a problem, they go, we can solve it. But we won't put the genie back in the bottle. It will keep on coming out. But we're still at a really early stage globally with digitalization on maritime trade.
I think you have made some really interesting point. I think the best one for me is the 3D. There's a dark, dumb, and disconnected, right? I mean, if you think about even you give example of Musk and the smart containers right now, the fleet. I would like to think that 80% of the goods movement on the sea right now is the 3D, which is dark, dumb, and disconnected. Would you agree with me? Or probably more than that.
I think
Right?
it probably is more than that.
Yeah.
The ocean carriers, or the reefer container owners, they've moved to do it because they can see a real ROI.
Yeah.
They want
Yeah.
to reduce claims and they want to reduce loss.
Yeah.
But for everyday freight containers, unless they've got a very high value load, it's quite difficult sometimes for the shipping lines
Yeah.
to justify the investment.
Yeah, and the challenge is to move from those, to more, from dark, dumb, and disconnected to more visible, smart, and connected. And I think for me, this is probably the biggest takeaway. If I made a headline for this conversation, I'm going to do that. How to move from dark, dumb to disconnected to visible, smart, and connected. I think that's a great tagline for this conversation, right? And the way you outlined the issue we have in terms of course, the sea freight is sea freight. I mean, you can only move stuff fast. And I think, and what I'm thinking about this, and you probably know or not, there's a Elon Musk, one of the famous innovators right now. He started a company called a Boring Company, right? It's literally said Boring Company. So because he was sitting in traffic in LA, and then he realized one day, I'm sitting here for 4 years, and on one hand we are talking about going to Mars and Moon, and then why we cannot really find this solution of this bloody traffic, and I think he thought about it 3 4 years ago, and then he just tweeted about, okay, I'm going to start a boring company. It was a joke at that time, but it
Yeah.
needed some time. But then he invest about 100 million. Basically he said, in his example, that I have, it was again a joke but very interesting one. I have a pet snail called Jeff or whatever. He is uh, he said snail, he is 20 times more faster than current available boring technology. So
Yeah.
imagine snails 20 times faster. And he's right that the way we make inroads or undergrounds, the technology is just not fast enough. So what he's doing right now is, again, he's talking about hyperloop and how we can make our transportation better. So when you say this, I'm thinking, okay, imagine and I think you rightly said that the e-commerce world, everything is fast moving consumer goods. E-commerce, they think need fast, but most of the stuff made in on the other side of the pond, Far East Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, whatever, China. And then by the time it arrives, then somebody should think about how we can solve this problem of moving slow ships faster.
Well, I think it's not going to be physically faster because we're also up against, as I know a lot of your readers and viewers will be, and listeners, we're also up against sustainability issues. That's been a big thing for the industry.
Yeah.
So in terms of, the faster you steam, the more fuel you burn, so
Yeah.
there are lots of other factors at play and things that the shipping industry and the maritime trade industry need to take care of. But if you consider, back to our digitalization theme, that if we have the digital solutions, and that's where a lot of shipping lines are working, so that chain of forward information and collaboration with the customer is getting born, thanks to various digital solutions and data connectivity, then you can marry those two worlds because, okay, it might be weeks and weeks on water, but if there's a flow of information and communication, then you consider, might be e-commerce, but you've got floating inventory, essentially, if you consider it that way. So it enables, as you said, the supply chain planning, agility, risk management, because you've got that information on what's going on. And if your if your goods are in a container on a ship that hits a big storm out at sea,
Yeah.
or the ports are Chinese ports, because this has happened, where exports are coming from, get closed for weeks because of weather conditions. That is going to happen. This is the natural world and things are going to happen. But having the chain of communication is allowing, is advising and working together with supply chain managers to say, this is happening, we're advising you. And so you can go away and make contingency plans. We had a speaker from one of our sort of cold chain cool logistics events from Dole, responsible for managing Dole's movement of very large quantities of fruit out of South Africa into Europe and around the world. And he spoke at one of our events, and his speech was called Caveat Emptor, buyer beware. So he said, hey, shippers, supply chain managers, you won't need to know in detail about how all these pieces work, but educate yourself. How does my product actually flow around the world? What are the stop-off points and where might the risks be? So that's kind of hopefully what the shipping industry itself is now realizing is we need to put these technologies in place. We need to give our shippers visibility proactively, not after the fact, but real time, so they can make some decisions. And we all live by our devices these days, and we all expect that level of visibility and information at our fingertips. What the forward thinkers in shipping and a lot of the startups are saying, well, we should, professionally, we should expect that I can, like my Amazon, I can see where, it's 8 stops away, it's 6 stops away. We should start to expect and try and prepare for and build that same level of ease. So as I say, it's not all realized yet. And what we're seeing, and I don't know if it's the same with the supply within your supply chain discipline, is it's not like one mammoth project. It's lots of little projects that are contributing.
That needs to come together. Okay, no, I think it's great. I think the way you summarize, because one of the topics we want to do is the challenges and the enablers. And I think the way you summarize at the end is not one or two players going to do it. It's a lot of components within, and not just the startups or the existing giants in the seafood or maritime. I think the government and maybe they have to probably play the role as well to get this right. But before I end, I want to take your time and understand what the hell is going on with this container. Why it's so expensive? Why we don't have it? It's the biggest headache. How the hell are we going to solve that? What's happening?
It will get solved. The challenge is it will get solved. But the challenge, well, a couple of things. One, we know there's been some really steep hikes in rates.
Yes.
And this with the global displacement of containers.
Yeah.
And here in the UK, post-Brexit, we've got an extra complicating factor, which is we've got all this new paperwork and regulations, and there's no containers either. So, it's causing a massive headache for UK EU trade. So, how long do I have? We've had ongoingly, we've actually had a really strong shipping market, container shipping market, with a lot of demand. I think above what was expected. But what we've also had is this big, and this is partly is definitely down due to the pandemic because of border restrictions and staff shortages. We've had containers that have got displaced. Container trade is inherently imbalanced. There's virtually no balanced trade lane in the world. So you end up with empties that need to be repositioned. Yeah. Normally those empty containers, you attempt to do obviously a backhaul. You've got your front leg and a backhaul. So you're not shipping air around the world. It was always said that air was the most widely shipped container commodity, and that's not good for the environment and it's not good for shipping line earnings. But, so this imbalanced trade and repositioning, Muddassir, is going on all the time, but with a big knock-on effect now, because once containers that are expected to be in a certain place empty for pickup aren't there, you have this giant global headache. Imagine how finely balanced this huge network of shipping lanes, alliances, port calls is. And then imagine trying to say, oh, that's over there now and it should be over there. How are we going to solve that? So we have had a knock-on effect. They will dig it out, but because of the complexity of the global shipping network, it probably takes a month to do that. I know. And that has caused container shortages. So, the costs are going up. There are different opinions on why that is. But for a shipping line,
they're counting their money because they could.
Well, yeah.
Simple as that. Because they could, they will.
Yeah. Well, speaking from the point of view of someone who's followed shipping for years, the rates have been pushed down to at times unsustainable levels from the shipping company's point of view. This is an old game of ping pong.
But talking about a monopoly, right? This is what my annoyance with the whole seafarer. I mean, there's only 5-6 players you can talk to, and if they all do the same, and I'm thinking again, this is my skeptical self is coming out right now. I think there's a combined game has been played between the top 4 players, right? And Kuna, Naga, Musk, and all that. Sorry for criticism if I'm doing it openly, because they just all of them are taking advantage, and there's not many shipping companies you can go to, right? So it's only 5 or 6 big players which moves 90% of your sea freight stuff, right? If they're all doing it, and all of them got it wrong in terms of imbalance of these containers, as you explained, something doesn't smell right to me.
Well, I appreciate that point of view. I would like to point out that it's strictly illegal for shipping lines to talk to each other about pricing matters, even when they're in an alliance and multiple shipping lines. Containers are carried on a single vessel, which is what happens today. But it is strictly illegal to do that. And
they don't have to. They know the prices is available.
Just saying, because I would be missing my duty for maritime trade, not to point that out to you. And you said, I don't think it was the shipping lines. It was actually, I will guarantee the shipping lines were not saying, "Hey, let's create this chaos so our container repositioning and empty containers are all out of whack and all out of kilter over the world." It was. It was external factors that caused that. If you think about when there's an airline, you're at the airport and there's an airline strike, or when there was the volcano, airplanes got stranded all over the world where they weren't supposed to be, and it took them a while to be able to reset the network to its normal operating patterns, and that's what we're seeing in container shipping. It remains very challenging. Port congestion and capacity are definitely issues. So it's not purely at the shipping line's door. Bigger forces at play, and yes, obviously I'm a proponent for maritime trade and shipping.
Of course, you made your career. Of course, you're gonna defend it. I don't expect otherwise. But I'm gonna leave you this thought, right? And then you should think about it maybe in your next episode and stuff.
Yeah.
I just recently watched this movie called Big Short, right? Where there's a PhD. Have you seen that movie?
Yes, no. I have.
Yeah. So anybody who's seen know that there's a doctor who actually he was a fund manager, and he found out in 2000, I think in 7 or 6, 2 years ago, before the 2008 financial crisis, that because the way the mortgage market works is all fake and it's basically not, I mean, they use the word fraudulent, but not really very well controlled, which imposes a lot of risk. And then eventually when the housing market comes down, the whole financial crisis started. The point I'm making with this example is this. There might be fundamentally something wrong, or how it was the shipping industry and the imbalance or inherent imbalance was working. I think what COVID pandemic has done is actually exaggerated that imbalance or the inherent problem, how the whole network is designed in terms of where the container should be, who needs to do what to make sure if a pandemic like COVID happens, then what's going to happen? How are we going to deal with it? Because in supply chain, we continue to talk about contingency planning, risk management, right? We continue to talk about that. Of course, clearly nobody thinks about you're going to hit by a global pandemic when nobody comes out for like hundreds of days. You cannot plan for that. I'm not saying that's everybody knows, but now it's time to maybe rethink and then see how we're going to get this right, because something is not right where you are, where the industry is.
I won't disagree with you there at all. And again, This has been a topic of conversation for, I'd say, some decades now, amongst shipping lines and other parties, or the maritime container supply chain. How you deal with these imbalances and how you make this work. And some of the other supply chain innovations, technology innovations, have been platforms that are facilitating the loading, unloading, finding loads and load matching. There's a lot of that happening in trucking. Right. And there's a lot of players coming into the container world to see if we can finally do something to address this sort of global imbalance issue and facilitate it. So there's a number of companies now that are helping to facilitate container exchange between different shipping lines. And technology is, including AI, machine learning, some pretty big technology to make sense of big data, to say, well, to do exactly what you say. Can we crack this? Can we crack this issue? So it's not like there's no effort going in, because of course, consider it's disruption for your supply chain community. But it's also a massive disruption for the shipping lines as well, and the ports, because suddenly stuff ends up all over the place that it shouldn't be. So imagine the number of hours, notwithstanding your understandable cynicism, and the amount of resource, person power that's going in now to trying to solve this and sort it out. It's a big challenge, and the lines are very aware that that they need to get on top of this.
Yeah. Rachel, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I absolutely learn a lot. I think we need to do one more episode on the what's happening next, actually, because I think that's important. We can talk about what's happening next, but we cannot.
I would love to.
All of that in one video. So maybe we can do in something, a second follow up on this 3 and 4 months time when the things will be better. As you said, remember, Rachel said they're going to be all fine in 3 months time. So if that doesn't happen, contact Rachel, right? But I think there's 2 things you said, which is, you said a lot of great stuff, and I'm taking some notes, and I've already got a brilliant title. But people talk about supply chain digitalization, which is the main theme about it, but they don't really know which technology actually goes where. And this is my biggest bugbear. So I call myself I'm a supply chain digitalization evangelist, and my biggest bugbear is every software provider I use or talk to, oh, we got AI, we got machine learning, but they don't actually tell people what is exactly that means and how people can adopt to improve the business. So no point throwing me buzzwords. So tell me how I'm going to use it, how I'm going to benefit it, right? But there's 2 things you said, which actually a classic example where you have explained the problem that Bill of Lading, the oldest document in the shipping industry, goes through many connected partners, very important. But if you apply a blockchain as the right technology, which is distributed ledger between all the parties, is the right application to use for that specific problem. That's a perfect example. Somebody who knows where is the business problem and the technology to use to solve that. Second one, you said about how the smart containers are working, connected containers, to improve the visibility, because you cannot make them faster because you have the sustainability, the challenge at the same time, but you can improve the balance by improving the visibility by using internet, IoT, Internet of Things, by improving the connected with the boxes, therefore the data, therefore the visibility. Again, a very good example of somebody knows the business problem and somebody knows of which technology to use where. So with that said, very impressed how you have done it, and I think I'm going to use that piece to separately actually to promote as well. Rachel, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And any last words before we finish?
No, just that, other than to thank you for the opportunity. Very much enjoyed the conversation, and we'll look forward to hopefully another one, because it's a big topic, same as supply chains, a huge topic. So if you'll have me back, there's other dimensions we can explore, and I'll go away and talk to some of my colleagues about the container repositioning situation and hopefully have an update for you.
Absolutely looking forward, and thank you very much, folks. So if you like this video, as usual, like, share, subscribe. I'm going to tag Rachel. She's tagged if she's watching this episode. If you lost it that long, please follow Rachel as well. Have a good one. Keep it simple and keep it real. Cheers. Bye.